It's my pleasure to introduce David Papineau for the next talk. David, as most of you know, is Professor of Philosophy of Science at King's College London. Works in metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, and has written a whole range of influential and widely read books. What's the most recent one? Roots of Reason, and Thinking About Consciousness, Philosophical Naturalism. I'm sure many of you know them. So, without further ado, David on telling what it's like.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you to the organisers, Javi and Darian, for inviting me here. It's a very interesting conference on phenomenology and naturalism. Okay, well, I'm afraid I don't know that much about phenomenology. I mean, I'm a graduate philosopher and I had to pick something up, and I've been doing a bit of homework, but it's not one thing, is it? I mean, it's many, many different theses in different people's books and many different approaches. Now, in that way, it's not that different from naturalism, which I'm supposed to know something about. Again, naturalism is a term even in contemporary British usage, which covers a whole pile of different views and approaches. Doesn't matter too much today. I'm going to focus on one rather specific issue about the nature of our access to conscious experience. But I thought I'd just start off, since I've got you all here, saying a few general things. And one thing I'd like to just start off by saying something about is the ontological strand in contemporary naturalism. Because here I do think there's a point at which contemporary naturalists, English-speaking naturalists, are at odds with some aspects of the phenomenological tradition, and I think there's a good argument on their side. So contemporary naturalists tend to be physicalists or materialists. They think that all causally efficacious states, including mental states, must be identical with, or at least realized by, material or physical states. And that includes conscious states. They think conscious states are one and the same as brain states, or perhaps some more complicated kind of material state. I mean, in a sense, they think that all there is the physical world. I mean, they're not eliminativists. They don't want to say there's just a physical world and therefore no consciousness. They think consciousness is just one part of the physical world. For me to be in pain is nothing more than for me to be a being with certain physical processes going on. And I take it that this position is in conflict at least with the position we had outlined in the first talk by Rudolph, the Husserlian position that the world and lived experience and the material world studied by science are separate realms. I said there's a strong argument for this position. It's not just a fad. I mean, it's true that materialism has sprung up in the philosophical world in the last 50 years or so, but it's not just, I think, a matter of fashion. I think it's sprung up because it's been forced on us by scientific developments. In particular, it's forced on us by the causal closure of the physical realm. The idea here is that science tells us that all physical effects, including the movements of our bodies, have physical causes. And so if the conscious mind is going to have physical effects, as clearly it does, it had better be one and the same with the physical causes of those physical effects. Otherwise, there's no room for a distinct conscious realm to make a difference to the movements of our bodies. Nice, simple argument. If it's such a good argument, why hasn't everyone always been a materialist? Well, the answer is that premise, the causal closure of the physical realm, is a new one. I think if you look at the history of informed Western thought, you will find that even the most scientifically informed people were happy interactive dualists until 150 years ago. They saw no difficulty about the idea of an independent mental realm making a difference to the physical world. And if you think that, then the argument I just gave you doesn't bite. There's no reason to suppose that the conscious mind must be identical with the brain in order to have it having effects. Has effects in its own right. Nothing in science tells us that physical effects can't be caused by non-physical causes. And I've written about this quite a lot, and I think the history of science is very, very interesting in that it's a very recent thing to take the view that all physical effects, including the movements of our bodies, are due to prior physical processes. And I think it's developments in 20th century physiology that have forced this view on informed thought. Middle of the 20th century, Huxley and Hodgkin explained the nature of nerve transmission in electrical and chemical terms, and I think that had a profound influence on philosophers. It's not an accident that all the philosophers producing arguments for materialism, in different ways appealing to the causal closure of the physical, started doing so in the middle of the last century. So, I think it's a very powerful form of argument, and it's a form of argument that ought to be grappled with by philosophers, whatever their starting point. I mean, you might start out as a phenomenologist, idealist, but if you respect the findings of science, I mean, you could always just dig your head in the sand and deny what science tells us, but if you respect the findings of science, then this is an argument you have to deal with. I was interested in the first talk. Would Husserl have to deal with it? Well, the argument assumes that the conscious world causes physical effects, and Rudolph said that's not something that Husserl would agree, but at least he had a conditionality, you said. Presumably the movements of my body are conditional on prior conscious processes, and it's not clear that even that is consistent with the modern causal closure of the physical. So I just wanted to put that to you, that those of you who feel that it's obvious that we've got to avoid reductionism, that we can't reduce the conscious mind to the material world, there's a serious argument here you need to think about. I mean, having said that, of course, this argument is consistent with many different species of physicalism stroke materialism. You might be a strong identity theorist, you might be a so-called non-reductive physicalist who identifies conscious states with kind of structures or so on. You might be a neutral monist, like Galen, who feels that science only tells us at second hand about the things that we are in direct contact with in conscious experience. But all these views will deny a dualist position where the world of lived experience is different from the material world studied by science. Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to start off with that. That's not what I'm going to talk about at all. I don't want to. I now want to come on to methodological epistemological issues, because I imagine there are many people here who think of themselves as part of the phenomenological tradition, but are perfectly happy to accept the ontological point I've just made. They might feel that the importance of phenomenology is not to do with metaphysics and ontology, but to do with methodology. And there's one line of thought, which is surely all our access to reality starts with the world of lived experience, and that must be the beginning point of philosophy. I'm not sure a naturalist would even be very happy with that. Naturalized epistemologists think of knowledge as depending on reliable causal processes giving rise to beliefs, and it's not clear that reliable processes have to consist entirely of conscious processes. It's not clear they have to involve conscious processes at all. So there's a certain aspect of naturalism which says that even when it comes to epistemology, there's no reason to suppose that consciousness has any fundamental prior role. But I'm not going to press that point. I want to focus on a much more specific point. I want to focus on a point which is very close to what David Roden was arguing in a talk about an hour ago, which is that there's certain facts about consciousness itself that we can't know via the method of phenomenological reflection. We need to appeal to science, cognitive science, neuroscience, to tell us what conscious states are like. Now I take this, maybe there's some phenomenologists here who are perfectly happy about this too, but I take this to be something which may be difficult for those in the phenomenological tradition. There are people who do neurophenomenology, there are people who ally cognitive science and phenomenology, but I take it at first pass, the picture they have is this. We use traditional methods of phenomenological reflection to investigate the structure of consciousness. We then do various kinds of experiment studies to draw up correlations between various kinds of conscious states identified by traditional methods and various material processes. The position I want to argue for here suggests that even that much phenomenological priority is not guaranteed. It may be that you can't even tell what it's like for you without appealing to the findings of empirical science, apart from phenomenological reflection. Okay, so that's the thing I want to. That's a preamble. So I've got a number of examples of this kind of issue, and the one I want to start with is also one alluded to by David Roden earlier, and this is to do with colour perception, in particular perception of colour contrasts. I mean, this is something I've been working on in any case, and what I'm going to be telling you about for the next 10 minutes is something I think is of interest in its own right. The payoff for today is just one aspect of it. So, here's the facts about colour vision. We can discriminate something like 10 million different shades when they're presented side by side. It's like this. Take 10 million samples evenly placed across the colour space, and give a person, normal person, in reasonable conditions, two of them side by side. They can reliably tell you whether they're the same or different. You can see very, very fine differences. On the other hand, we are pretty terrible at re-identifying colours when they're shown singly, like that one I showed earlier on, and then we're shown another one sometime later, and then we're asked, are they the same or different? And there, you can only reliably say whether the two samples are the same or different if you start off with something like 30, 100, something of that order, colour samples evenly spaced. We're very bad. So, I mean, I won't do it because I'm terrible about these fancy PowerPoints, and the colours don't come out right, and I only had a limited number of samples. But for instance, it's pretty obvious those are different. But then, okay, which of those was that one? Well, perhaps it's obvious on this. Anyway, you get the idea. You can do very well when they're side by side. You can't do very well re-identifying over time. Okay. Now, most people, nearly everybody in this area, I mean, I thought I was the only exception, but there's somebody in New Jersey called Peter Mandic who's been working on this too, and he's published some stuff, and he develops the same line as I'm going to give you here. Nearly everybody thinks what this shows is that there's 10 million ways, different ways it can be for us when we look at the surface, colour-wise. 10 million different colour experiences we can have. There's some debate among the vast majority of people who think this, that a lot of you will be familiar with, about whether all those different 10 to the 7th different ways things can be are conceptualized. Some people take from the fact we can only re-identify about 100, the conclusion we only have 100 color concepts, and therefore conclude there's all these differences in colour experience which outstrip our conceptual powers, non-conceptual content. Others, John McDowell, Bill Brewer, say not so fast. Who says we don't have 10 to the 7th, 10 million different colour concepts? Okay, they're rather ropey concepts, they're very short-lived, they're not very good at enabling us to re-identify things over time, but we've got lots of all the experience is conceptual. But what they all agree about, all those two sides, is that there are 10 to the 7th different ways it can be for us colour-wise when we look at a surface. But here's a different view, which doesn't require, I mean, it's kind of conceptualist, it's hyper-conceptualist, doesn't require multiplying all these colour concepts. It says when you're presented with a colour surface by itself, there's only about 100 different ways it can be for you. It's 100 different colours, that's it. 100 different ways it can be if you look at something. In addition, though, we have another ability to tell when two surfaces are presented side by side, whether they are of different shades. And in that case, we can make those discriminations for 10 million. So the thought here is that when you're presented with two side by side, you can see they're different, even though, suppose we're in the middle of the reds, red 27, red 28, even though when you looked at them by themselves, it would produce exactly the same response. So the idea here is that in addition to our 100-odd basic colour response, we have ability to make another kind of judgment that these two are different, which is a kind of Gestalt judgment, it's a relational judgment. It doesn't derive from our first noting that this is one colour, red 27, that's red 28, and therefore they're different. We don't have the ability to note that something's red 27, we just note they're both red and that they're different. Okay? On the second view, when you look at red, I've got blue there, or whatever, red 27, red 28, and you look at red 31, red 32, these are all different shades within the few 100,000 reds. That pair looks just the same as that pair, even though if you took 27 and 31, put them next to each other, they'd look different. Put them next to each other. So the idea is we have 100 odd neat colour experiences plus an ability to primitively note differences. So I hope those two views are clear. And this is like Michelle's question. Michelle asked David, how can you be sure there really are all these millions of different colour experiences if our re-identifying ability is so bad? And I'm giving a way of explaining how there could be only a few colour experiences, and in addition explain why we can make all these fine-grained discriminations for side by side. Okay, now, which view is right? I mean, here's two views, and they're quite different views about what's going on in our colour experience. One view says, show you the samples, there's 10 million different ways it's going to be for you. The other view says, samples one at a time, there's only 100 different ways. You've got 100 colour boxes, and you put each sample into one of 100 boxes. Now, that's two views about the nature of our colour experience, the nature of conscious experience. And it's not at all obvious to me that we're going to make any headway in deciding between these views by phenomenological reflection, by thinking directly about how it is for us when we're having these experiences. On the other hand, it seems to me there's some pretty obvious considerations. Why did I put that? Just to convince you that blue 27, blue 28, and blue 31, blue 32 look just the same, but I cheated, they're just the same. Here's some pretty obvious ways of thinking about which view is right. I mean, here's how I'd argue for the minority radical view I favour. If you look at what the brain does with chromatic information, with wavelengths coming in from the the retina, does two rather different things. One thing it does, it uses wavelengths to help detect edges. So a large part of the visual system is involved in constructing a representation of the three-dimensional, normal, medium-sized physical objects around us. In order to do that, it's got to identify surfaces and edges. And by and large, it uses intensity differences to identify edges. If there's a locus in the visual field where the intensity of the light varies across the locus, the brain tends to assume that's an edge of a surface. But it also has cells that look for wavelength differences independently of intensity differences. And that's, in fact, a rather good way of identifying edges, because it won't be fooled by shadows. Shadows give you intensity differences, but they don't give you wavelength differences. So the brain uses wavelength information, chromatic information, to detect edges, to help construct the three-dimensional scene. But it also does something very different with color information, chromatic information. It uses it to re-identify objects, type of objects. Is that the same jersey she was wearing yesterday? Is that the same kind of bird as that? Is this fruit ready to eat? Now, for this purpose, fine-grained color discriminations aren't any use. It'd be overkill. I mean, jerseys, birds, fruit, they kind of change. 100 categories would be fine for that kind of purpose. So, nobody's quite sure whether categorial 100-odd color classification system is the brain. People have identified the A thing, the cells that detect wavelength differences, fairly early on in the visual cortex. And those cells throw away the absolute wavelength difference, absolute wavelengths. They're not very interested in exactly what wavelength is here and exactly what wavelength is here. They're just interested in, is there a difference? That's understandable, because changes in light and all kinds of things affect absolute wavelength, but not the wavelength differences. So there's reason to suppose there's two different systems in the brain. One which detects differences and throws away the absolute color information, the other which detects colors but only makes a few coarse-grained discriminations. And this account of what's going on in the brain is supported by dissociation data. The most interesting is cerebral achromatopsia. So the first time I developed this view, somebody said, but look, your view is crazy, because if there are these two different mechanisms, well, somebody could have some brain injury, which would mean that they can't do this anymore. They don't classify objects into colors, but they can do that, and that makes no sense. How could that be? How could somebody see color differences? And I thought, well, that's a good point, but no doubt I thought there is somebody like that, and it will be interesting to find out what it's like for them. And there are people just like that. What it's like for them, they say, we don't see any colors. It's all black and white and grey. They don't have the higher order color classifiers, but they can still see edges or they can see lines where the difference is purely color and not intensity. So they have no difficulty in picking out objects manifested by color differences, even though wavelength differences, even though they say that they have no color vision. Conversely, it's not so obvious in the other direction. Are there people who can't detect edges, do A, but see colors B? Well, if you can't detect edges, and wavelength edge detection is all tied up with intensity edge detection, you won't have much of a sense of a three-dimensional situation around you, and it's rather difficult to see colors because you can't really place them on anything. You can't do color constancy because you haven't got color, you haven't got surfaces yet. But they do say that it seems kind of ready over there, even though they aren't detecting any edges. So look, if you think those considerations are plausible, that argues that conscious visual perception contains information about fine-grained differences and about broad categories, but not about fine-grained categories. There was information in the brain at a very early stage about the absolute wavelengths over a very fine-grained level of detail, but the brain threw that away very early on. Once it had extracted the difference information, it threw away the absolute wavelengths, and so it doesn't seem that there's any room left for the brain to be manifesting absolute wavelengths in consciousness. So there's an argument for the minority second view about what's going on in colour perception over the first one. But note how the route to this conclusion proceeded entirely by appeal to facts about what the brain is doing and how it does it, and not via introspective reflection on what's given in experience. And I put you that in this case it seems very unlikely introspective reflection could decide it in the way that the cognitive considerations can. Okay, here's another example, a different example. Which features are registered in conscious visual experience? So, how rich is the content of our visual experience? And now I'm focusing on visual experience, as you'll see. Well, it's uncontentious that visual experience... I'm going to talk about... I don't want to get bogged down in issues about representation. I don't need that for today's purposes. I use register there. I mean, the question is just what differences in the world are matched by differences in the properties of experiences. And whether these properties of experiences are representational or not, it doesn't matter. It's just how many differences in experience are there. Okay. Now we want to contrast people who know about things like lemons and the look of them, and avocets, that's a certain kind of somewhat, not fortunately so rare bird. The letter A, some people might not be familiar with the Roman alphabet or that kind of graphics and so on. Okay, so now the question is this. Of course everybody with normal vision sees the colours and the shapes. But now consider somebody who knows about lemons, is familiar with lemons, observe them in different circumstances, and somebody who's never come across them at all. Will their experience on looking at this be different? Similarly here, once you, bird watchers know that once you've kind of got to recognise the bird, kind of, they pop out. I used to go looking at birds with an old Essex fellow, and we'd go and look at these ducks, and on the estuary where we went, there'd be like 3,000 ducks, and I could see there's some mallards and there's some, and he'd say, look at that gadwall. And I'd say, what do you mean? He said, the gadwall's a rather nondescript bird, right? And he said, can't you see it's right there? And I'd look and look at it, I mean, nothing, just, a lot of grey birds, but for him it stood right out, okay? Now, so the question is, do these higher categories feature in visual experience? Does it make a difference to the way it looks for you to be familiar with lemons, avocets, various kinds of script? Well, some people say yes. Susanna Siegel's just written a very nice book arguing just that, for the rich view of visual experience. Higher categories, types of bird, types of fruit and so on, are represented in visual experience in addition to the colours and shapes of the objects that instantiate them. It's visually different if you're familiar with lemons to look at this picture than if you're not. Okay, others disagree. Ray Jackendorf, Jesse Prince. They think that visual perception only presents us with colours, shapes, faces, maybe faces, but certainly not kinds of birds, kinds of fruit. I mean, of course, they agree that once you become an experienced bird watcher, something different goes on in you from when you're naive. I mean, that's a datum, I take it, that something was going on in my friend, enabled him to see the gadwall that wasn't going on in me. But Prince would argue that that's just a matter of his being prone to attend to a bunch of colour and shape properties that I'm not prone to attend to. Possibly also as a result, his being disposed to think Gadwall when I'm not disposed to think that. But Jesse says it's not a matter of there being, once you hold fast all the colours and shapes that you see, some extra phenomenology associated in vision with Gadwallness. So Siegel argues against then that her story, and she looks at various cases and so on, gives a better explanation of the expert-naive difference than theirs does. Prince has one argument that goes like this. I'm not so sure it's a good argument, that surely if something's a visual property, you can visually imagine it by itself. But you can't imagine lemonness without imagining a colour and a shape. I mean, I'm not sure how good an argument this is, because it's not obvious that you can imagine shapes without colours or colours without shapes. But anyway, it's an argument he gives, and it's not my fault. This looks to me a much more telling argument. This is the one that interests me. Prince points out, or he argues, he appeals to various studies. If you now think about it, I said there are no cells, but the studies are functional imaging studies, the imaging studies, so it's more areas than cells. But he says there's no areas that respond to rich categories independent of physical form in the visual cortex. So, the example he gives is an umbrella. I mean, there are cells in the visual cortex that will respond to a rolled up umbrella, whether it's this way up or that way up or seen from the end. I mean, those cells are abstracting away from orientation. But, Prince's point is, there aren't any cells in the visual cortex that respond to categories like this, independent of form. In particular, there's no cells that will respond both to a filled up umbrella and an open umbrella. No cells that will respond to an avocet flying and an avocet dead and cut open. I'm just trying to make sure the form, there's no common form. So that looks quite telling. If visual context goes with what's going on in the visual cortex, and there's no cells in the visual cortex corresponding to the kinds of responses Siegel believes in, then it looks like that's a strong argument against her position. So again, it looks like facts about the brain are telling us about what's going on in subjective consciousness. Okay, now, good. I've got a couple more examples, but what comes now won't be too long, and it's of the nature of a complication. And I think in the end this complication doesn't make any difference, but I'll go through this because it's interesting. You might have been worrying about my form of argument. My argument looked in both cases at what's going on in those areas of the brain that correspond to visual consciousness. And I concluded in the first case that we didn't get any fine-grained colours in visual consequence. In the second case, we didn't get higher-order categories. And the reason was, I mean, the higher categories and the fine-grained colours are represented somewhere in the brain, I mean, at least to the extent that fine-grained wavelengths come in and are used in the computations that look for the differences. So down there in the early stages of visual processing is something corresponding to fine-grained colour differences. And no doubt somewhere in the brain we recognise that things are lemons and avocets and so on. But the thought was that in the first case the fine-grained differences were too low down to be conscious, and in the second case they were too far up to be conscious, and so I'm assuming in the argument that visual consciousness corresponds to some areas of the brain in the middle. But how did I know that? Except by presumably assuming that that we aren't conscious of the things that are going on in the wrong areas. And it looks like my argument is somehow circular. I mean, somebody who did think we were conscious, that they'd just say, well, doesn't that show that the very early stages of visual processing are conscious? How did I rule that out? And so I was implicitly presupposing that there was a certain level of processing in the brain that corresponds to visual consciousness, and it might look that that's begging the question. Well, perhaps it's not begging the question too badly. Perhaps we can look to other cases of conscious states to pinpoint which areas of the brain correspond to visual consciousness, and then use that to decide these hard cases. So don't start with fine-grained colour perception and categorical visual perception, but look at other cases of visual consciousness and use that to figure out which areas of the brain underpin it. And that's, I think, roughly what can be done, and so I think the arguments I was giving you still stand up. But in fact, and this is the complication, it turns out that this methodology of using clear cases to decide which areas of the brain yield consciousness is less than straightforward. And I'm going to finish by looking at some recent stuff by Ned Block. This won't bear directly on the two cases I've been talking about. It raises some rather different issues, but it's the same methodological point. Now let me see if I can do this. The third example, which will be another example of how do we know what's in consciousness, is change blindness. Now I said my audiovisual skills were limited. Let me try and do it. It's a very hard one. I mean, there's some relatively easy ones that you've met before, but this one is a sod. And so you can see a rabbit front. It's actually this little thing here. Look at that. Now, once I show you, you will see it. But you would never, I mean, even if you'd had them both there, and or you'd had the thing, and you'd kind of done it very carefully, grid by grid, it's very hard to spot. But once you see it, it's easy. Very strange. So, I mean, there's, as I said, that's a pretty limited example. There's some very striking examples of this. Now, so here's the question. Did you consciously see the flower, the absence, the flower, the absence, the flower, the absence, before I pointed it out to you? I mean, it wasn't forcing itself on your attention. If I'd asked you, you wouldn't have been able to tell me about it, but was that in your conscious visual experience? I mean, very natural to suppose. I mean, there's the picture, you're looking at it, all the details are there. One time the flower's there, other time it's not. Or maybe we shouldn't think of visual experience as somehow being pixel-like. The nature of the whole thing depends on the nature of what's at each point in the field, and maybe your visual experience was just silent on what was there at that point. Maybe your visual experience, if you think of visual experience as involving hierarchical categories in the serial way, maybe it involved lots of flowery kind of details, that's what it's telling you, but not exactly what they were. Who knows? So here's another case where you don't know what's in your visual consciousness. Some people think that it's only conscious if you've attended to it, it's available for various kinds of planning and reasoning, and they will be inclined to say no, that difference is not conscious. It didn't get to the appropriate part in the front of the head, in the frontal cortex. Whereas other people who think the visual conscious depends on what's going on in the occipital visual cortex, and they'll say surely there was registering of those differences there, and that you were conscious. And again, there seems no good way of resolving it. Now, Ned Block's recently argued for the back of the brain answer by appealing to certain experiments that argue that there's sometimes awareness without accessibility. Sometimes you're aware of things that don't get to the front of the head. And here's the I'll just give you one. There's a range of these experiments. Okay, That was it. Okay, no. Here's the experiment. It's Sperling's experiment. It's quite old. It's 50 years old. So everybody says they could see an array of 9 alphanumeric characters. I tell you, you could all see that. That was was it 9 or was it 12? Well, an array, right? Good. So you could see the. Where are we? Okay. When you ask people to say what they were, they can characteristically do about 3 or 4, 5. But the funny thing is that, and it might involve a bit of training, I'm not quite sure, if you set it up so after they've seen the thing, if they hear a bell, they've got to give you the first line. If they hear a buzzer, they've got to give you the second line. If they hear a gong, they've got to give you the third line. They can do that. After they've seen it, little delay, I don't know, a couple of seconds, and then you say what was in the second line, they can do that. So Bloch argues that both the report that I could see all 12 and the fact that people can recover the information shows that they were conscious of all 12, even though limitations of what can get into the front of the head mean that you can only get 4 into the front of the head at any time when people are asking you to name them. So he argues that we should conclude on this basis that conscious visual awareness doesn't require this higher order accessibility. It's quite sufficient that certain things are going on at the back of the head. And then he argues that we can use this interesting case, which decides this issue, to tell us about other cases like the ones I was talking about. Now, in fact, his particular interest doesn't bear directly on my cases, so let's not go into that. But it's interesting to see how you can use some cases to fix which parts of the brain underpin consciousness, which can then help us decide other things. Now, in fact, Bloch's line is highly contested. I mean, there's a huge BBS issue on this with 40 people responding and the number of points people make. One is, were you really conscious of all 12 of them? I mean, you could see that there were 12 alphanumeric characters, but that's different from seeing each of them severally. And the fact that you can recover the information later doesn't mean necessarily it was conscious at the earlier time when it was exposed to you. Perhaps at some subpersonal level information is stored and then you can access it. And anyway, and this is a large issue raised by Bloch's arguments. How far should we rely on subjects' reports anyway? I mean, Bloch is committed to the idea that subjects' reports are unreliable, that there's going to be some cases where things are at the back of the head, they never get in any way to be accessed, and they're still conscious, and so Bloch's own argument tends to undermine the reliance on subject reports and tends to argue for what David was calling dark phenomenology, in which case it's not clear that his argument goes through anyway. But I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to show you that despite these complications, still the best strategy for deciding a difficult cases seems to be figure out which bits of the brain underpin consciousness and use that to tell us what's going on in consciousness in a way that we can't possibly find out just by phenomenological reflection. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so we started a little late, so I'm going to, with Javi's permission, run a little bit into the tea break perhaps, but not very much perhaps. Okay, so let's go.
Yeah, I have a question about your view on barely distinguishable shades of color.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine that we have a series of distinguishable or barely so shades of color, be 10, 12, so 11, 12, 13, 15, etc. The idea is supposed to be that whenever you have B10 and 11 side by side, you only see, say, B8 and that they're different, right? So you see BA on your left, BA on your right, and that they're different, something like that.
Yeah.
So then I can only see two options you can go. So if that's the case, then from B10 to B11 you see BA, from B11 to B12 you see BA2, from B12 to 13 maybe already BB or maybe not, but at some point there has to be a change in the category
Right.
those colors get seen
Yeah.
under. And if that's the case, then it seems that you would have a situation in which two color expanses which are very near to one another are taken to be of the same shade, but other two which are at the same distance between them are taken to be of different shades. I take it to be...
You think that's odd? No, look.
That sounds odd.
I don't think so. Look, let's do it with unnoticeable differences, just to make the point clear. I can construct a series that goes, this looks the same as that. We'll make the differences below the threshold discriminatively and go right along and take myself from the reds into the oranges. I mean, this is actually a terrible problem for everybody. Phenomenal Sorites series. They're much worse than ordinary Sorites series. But you haven't really put your finger on difficulty. Look, here's a whole lot of red things. Here's a whole lot of orange things. They're in a continuum. I'm going along. I've got to switch somewhere. Look, I mean, I'm judging. My brain is telling me red, and down here it's going to be orange, and there's got to be some point I go from red to orange. I mean, it can't be helped. So that's okay.
Yeah, well, in that case you can say that the difference is somehow vague. I'm not sure that you can say...
No, well, so that there's...
You can say that it's indeterminate whether they look different to you or something like that.
Okay, look, the orthodox view has a mess with that case because, and it's hard for me, but it's not as hard for me as it is for them. They're committed to when they look the same, the look of this is the same as the look of that. And this is worse than the standard Sorites thing because they've got an identity between the look of this and the look of that. And now we go along, and it's identity all the way along. And identity can't be intransitive. So that's a horrible, horrible problem for the standard view. It's pretty nasty for me, but since I don't really think of the judgments of sameness and difference as deriving from this is a certain way and that's a certain way, I've got a bit more room to manoeuvre.
So,
I'm sorry, we've got such a long queue. We'll have to stop it there.
We can talk about
I got several, but I'll ask the one that's least likely to get asked by anyone else. Well, actually, it's not a question, it's just a comment on your preamble, because there's always been an awful lot of monists, and in fact there's always been an awful lot of materialists who are fully realist about consciousness. So I just...
I'm just curious about the history.
Well,
so who do you have in mind?
Thales. Everything's made of water.
Okay.
No, but
so the ancients, I'm not sure. I mean, it's a project. I'm very curious about this, but the ancients, it's not quite clear. They're thinking of the material world and the mental world, and quite the way we do. But Hobbes,
Priestley,
okay,
all the German materialists. In fact, Hume really, but he's not saying it out loud.
So
these are all materialists.
So when are the German materialists? I mean, by the time you get into the 19th century, you do have people who are materialists, in my sense. And I'm curious to find out how do they deal with the standard anti-materialist arguments, like the knowledge argument and so on. I don't know what this.
Actually, you could have Locke as well. He's really a materialist too. But the point is only that the story in which nearly everyone was happy to be interested until 50 years ago doesn't quite like that. But a lot of people had strong motivation in favour of monism anyway, because you don't want to multiply types of things beyond necessity. And if you're wise to the point that we don't know the nature of the physical.
Okay. I'm curious about materialist monists. I mean, Hobbes is an interesting case.
He's a clear case.
Yeah, Lemaitre maybe, and then in Helmholtz in late 19th century. I mean,
well, Regis as well.
Well, I mean, I don't know enough, but they are idealist monists is is different,
Yeah.
and it's not quite clear how this. I mean, I sometimes curious about this argument is going to be difficult for idealists because they're going to have to construct within the
Well, the
idealist
the
world.
basic argument is really simple.
Yeah.
It's just an argument, as it were, from ignorance. First you get to it, and in fact, Kant says, for all we know, monism is true. We just don't know enough to have any good reason to posit two substances. So that's the main argument, is ignorance. We have no, on what grounds do we have for positing two substances?
Okay, but think. I mean, we should talk about this. But I'm curious about this. Suppose you started off as a 20th century British phenomenalist, right? And then you've got, I mean, Berkeleyan, right? You've got the world of sense data, and within it you reconstruct the physical world as a subpart of it, right? And now you're going to have this argument that these physical effects have, by your own light's physical causes, the same physical effects as you want to say have mental causes, and now you're in a mess. And my view is that that's what made 20th century English-speaking idealism implode. I mean, you have people like Quine starting off as effectively a phenomenalist, and 30 years later he's a physicalist. And what happened?
Okay, John. Thank you.
This is not a philosophical objection, just a piece of empirical curiosity
Yeah.
what the facts are. Again, going back to your first example about, as it were, what we can discriminate versus what we can re-identify when it comes to colours. I find myself wondering how specific that phenomenon is to the case of colours.
Good.
I mean, the trick you played where you showed us them side by side, and then a few minutes later, just one of them, and we didn't know which was which.
Right.
I bet you can play the same trick with, say, musical pitches.
Quite, absolutely. I mean, I just haven't...
And then I wondered if headway could be made in adjudicating between competing explanations of the phenomenon by seeing how readily they generalise different kinds of caves. I don't know what the analog
That's all fine. I mean, the analogy with pitch should be good. I just have...
It's not.
No, hang on. I haven't looked at it enough. So for most people, the ability to hear pitch differences far outruns the ability to identify absolute pitch, except supposedly with people with perfect pitch. But I'd be rather curious to know how good people with perfect pitch are, and I'd be amazed if it weren't also true for them that the ability to hear differences far outruns the ability to identify absolute pitches. Must be right.
They can suffer terribly because the orchestra is just a tiny bit out.
Yeah, but still, I mean, you might be able to identify 1,000
Sure.
distinct notes in the normal spectrum, but a million differences. I mean, so yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. I mean, supposing that I were to accept your the conclusion of your paper, but then put to you the point that the phenomenologist might say, well, there are other cases where actually phenomenology, or some version of phenomenology, actually gives a better explanation of what is going on. I mean, for example, in childbirth, a lot of people said that the best obstetrics gynecological evidence in a certain period showed that the most appropriate way for a woman to give birth is lying down with her feet in the stones. And lots of women started saying, no, this is really uncomfortable, this is not good for us, we like to be walking around. And the gynecologists started thinking, maybe they have a point here. I mean, I suppose that the general point I like to put to you is, why do you want to rely so much on what you're suggesting the best science that there is now tells us, rather than, if you like, a metaphysical or an ontological point about naturalism or materialism?
So I think I want to resist the idea that there's some area of experience where phenomenology remains inviolable, whereas I pointed to a few cases where you're going to need science to help. I mean, Mike's question to Dave Roden suggested that same thing. So I'd resist that. I mean, I think the kind of moral here should be applied across the board. But having said that, note that there's nothing in my story to say that first-hand awareness of one's experience is playing no role in the investigation. And in fact, it's perfectly obvious that that's not so. I mean, this whole business of studying consciousness can't get off the ground, except by starting with people know they're conscious, and then seeing what's going on in the brain at that point. So I certainly don't want to throw all that out altogether, first-person information. But I think I'd be inclined to argue that it's always corrigible. I'm looking at these cases, I'm kind of distrustful of first-person investigation of the nature of our conscious states. And look, this is a very messy area, but in both the cases, the colour cases and the change blindness case, not maybe so obviously the high case, there's a sense in which you might be inclined to say, it seems to us that all the detail is there. It seems to us that we're seeing all these different colours. And it requires quite a lot of detailed analysis and investigation to show that that seeming is a mistake. Now, the question is an interesting question. Where is that seeming that's a mistake about the nature of the experience? Is that in the experience itself? I mean, I've got a view that makes that, but if you contra Prince and go with Siegel, allow that experience can have higher order information, it might have information. There's a lot of visual detail out there, even though it's not giving you what the visual detail is. A very sensible thing for vision to be telling you, that there's a detailed world out there, and you only have to look to find out what's there. I mean, that's something you'd want your eyes to tell you. But that makes me worry. Maybe the phenomenological method can guard against this, but it makes me worry that people thinking about the nature of the experience are going to be misled about the actual nature of the experience just by the way it can at some other level seem. So I think we should always be on guard. Okay. Having said that, it's not obvious that the actual nature of experience, as opposed to how it seems to you, is an important thing in, say, clinical context. I mean, both might be important.
My question had actually partly been answered there. It was originally simply that it seems to me that what you said is that there are a great number of cases which cannot accurately be answered by phenomenology. You look at something like the colour example, and it's a scientific question, essentially. What is going on in the conscious state? We'll look at the evidence, but this is going on, or this is going on, the other thing isn't. But that doesn't seem to be an argument against phenomenology unless phenomenology makes the claim that it is a complete theory of consciousness, which I don't think it does. And if phenomenology is primarily concerned with what these things mean for us, you know, the things like the web of significances and all these kind of phenomenological questions about what role these facts play in our perception of ourselves in the world, then I'm not certain that that critique actually is that important against phenomenology.
I'm more than happy with all those points. I mean, I started off by saying I'm not, phenomenology many different things, I'm not clear I'm arguing against anything, I'm just going to give you the specific point that there's certain facts about consciousness you need brain science to help with. So if there's phenomenology that's not worried by that, that's great. And of course, I mean, look, phenomenology thought of, it's important for people, and it's important for people who are trying to help people with difficulties to understand what their experience is like and what meanings they see in the world. Of course, I'm all in favour of that, and approaches that deny that are a bad thing.
Okay, with apologies to all those people who are in the list, I'm sure some people won't forgive me if I don't let them have a cup of tea or coffee before the next session. So with all that, catch David in the tea break, catch him later with other questions. Thank you. Good.